This piece of research I will present today is a joint work by Mattia Guerini, Mauro Napoletano, Andrea Roventini, and myself. And this is part of my PhD thesis. And is basically tries to assess in a fully fledged, in a very large scale agent-based macroeconomic model, the challenges that and the mechanisms that are interrelated with analysis of financial contagion and the consequent macroeconomic stability. This is performed by means of agent-based computational techniques, and this is the alternative research. What motivates this work? After the Great Recession and the global financial crisis in 2008 that hit our economies, the financial system revealed its robust yet fragile nature, as was famously noted by N.L.'s speech in 2009. Sorry, I can hear any echo from the ground. Sorry.
Yes, if everyone can mute, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry. Okay, so after this, the financial after the Great Recession hit, there was a huge surge in the literature trying to study the mechanism under which such phenomena could have such an amplifying effect on the economy. And the main mechanisms that were being studied were financial-to-financial mechanisms, where, for example, they were firstly developed by the model of Diamond and Dubik, known as the bank runs model, and as I think very well summarized by Glasserman and Young in the Journal of Economic Perspective paper, Journal of Economic Literature paper, where they highlighted all the mechanisms that were underlying the so-called balance sheet contagion, which was one of the key features that triggered the burst of the subprime mortgage bubble. Another part of the literature can be traced back by the literature on the credit crunch and the credit cycles model by Kiyotaki and Moore. And it was basically more development on, the main focus was to study the financial to real transmission of these kind of shocks. Along with that, there was a very increase in the in literature that was mainly inspired by post-Keynesian, in the post-Keynesian tradition, that was analyzing how real to financial mechanisms were actually playing a great role. And this is typical of, has been typically identified in the so-called borrower's creditworthiness in a typical post-Keynesian tradition. And typically is also from the post-Keynesian tradition is to analyze the financial relationships between agents in the economy by considering the economy as a pure credit economy, where all the transactions among agents are considered as credit relationships that are being transferred from one agent to the other and from one deposit to a bank to another. This is also very in line with the tradition of has been also supported by the Bank of England, where in a very simple but very precise paper, they were analyzing how, they were describing how modeling the economy by following the post-Keynesian tradition, where credit relationships are transferred between another, is the most accurate way to model the process of money creation in the economy. So basically, we try to incorporate in this piece of research all these elements, and we are going to do this by means of agent-based computational models, which a large literature now is believing to be a suitable tool for modeling complex and especially evolving interactions. So our contribution focuses the contribution of the paper of this paper mainly focuses on find a way to model an endogenous network formation mechanism that we think is very well proxied by modeling, even if in a stylized way, by the system of payments that banks are key players in the system, of course. And this is also very is a recent stream of the literature, which has also found a lot of interest by policymakers. For example, there is the ABBA model of the IMF, where a very specific system of payments is modeled in order to analyze the transfer of deposits among the transfer of deposits and liquidities among financial intermediaries. We try to also implement a very simple policy experiment in which we test how the network evaluation mechanism developed by Barucca and co-authors and published in the Quantitative Finance recently performs when after we have modeled the way in which interbank ties among financial intermediates may arise, and how this framework can be used for systemic risk mitigation. Of course, by means of these experiments, we will try to perform some counterfactual analysis on macro and financial outcomes to try to answer both possibly to this kind of two research questions. What is the interbank structure that emerges from when we consider banks as agent that operates in the payment systems? And what is the effect of systemic risk mitigation policy when we do it by means of interbank asset evaluations? I will try to be clearer afterwards. So what is the starting point and the model? The model belongs, probably many of you will know the Schumpeter meeting Keynes agent-based model. I will not, unfortunately, I cannot describe the whole functioning of the model here due to time constraints. However, the Schumpeter meeting Keynes class of models, which have been published in several extensions and versions in peer-reviewed journals, in many peer-reviewed journals, is a model of endogenous growth where firms basically face deep uncertainty and are constrained by a considerable amount of asymmetric information when dealing with economic relations among each other. To briefly describe that, we have a set of capital good firms that are producing a capital good, which basically are investing in research and development and produce heterogeneous machineries. These machineries, are heterogeneous in productivity and of course in efficiency, and these will affect, of course, the investment that consumption good firms will perform. Why? Because consumption good firms, in order to meet expected demand, are investing by how? Buying machineries produced by capital good upstream firms. Banks are in this particular version of the model that I will present are managed payments between the agents, and as also in the previous versions of the models, they provide loans to consumption good firms. Banks are subject to a very simple fixed capital requirement, and base their credit decisions. The supply of credit is set according to also the conditions of the borrowers they are connected to. So in somehow they are influenced by the supply of credit is influenced, of course, by the financial conditions of the consumption good firms. Then we have a central bank that fixes the interest rate in the economy, and we have a government that levies taxes on profits and pays unemployment benefits. The starting point of this extension of the Keynes plus meeting Schumpeter cluster model is a version of the model where banks are characterized by the following balance sheet, where we have only loans provided to consumption good firms, bonds acquired by the government that issue bonds in order to finance the unemployment benefits. Sorry, and accordingly, we also have deposits which are automatically generated when the agents receives deposit their own cash reserves and the reserves they obtain when, for example, they obtain a loan from the bank. So we try to model the missing channel in this. In this setup by try to study the real effects and the financial effects of financial shocks, especially trying to investigate the finance to finance transmission mechanism. Once an interbank network formation, once an interbank network has been formed. So basically, what we do is acknowledge that in the overall structure of the model, there is already an implicit network structure. And if we better explicit the payment relationships that banks are able to perform and in the payment system, so managing the payments among economic agents, we basically we basically can recognize that whenever this exchange of deposits that stems from payments that come from capital good firms that send machineries to consumption good firms, which are acquiring them, of course, they continuously open asset and liability position in the interbank market in order to manage these payments. And once we consider these two pillars, these two very, I think, realistic assumptions, we can imagine a network that emerges. We can actually model an interbank network that emerges in a way which is dynamic because it evolves at every time step, at every period, depending on what? On the relationships that occur that are existing between, in this case, consumption good firms and capital good firms. Of course, consumption good firms may eventually acquire buy machineries from different capital good firms, which and this, I mean, this relationship among the consumption good firms and capital good firms that can change over time also maps into the interbank network that we will try to explain later better in a dynamic way. Why I think is also extremely I think is extremely important here is that once we consider the interbank formation mechanism as dependent upon the relationships that agents have between each other and the subsequent management of payments of these agents, we think that the network that emerges is empirically relevant. The interbank network that emerges is empirically relevant because these relationships may depend also. I mean, depend also on the sectoral firm-bank credit linkages, and this is a very recent stream of literature that has studied how sectoral linkages and, of course, the implied connection between banks and these different sectors play a role in shaping dynamic interbank relationships and also eventually the spread of systemic risk. So just to give you an idea how this is, how we thought about this, I will try to make a very stylized example. So suppose that, I mean, in our economy, in our simulated economy, we have a set of banks. This is not the number. The real number is just a simplified example. We have banks, consumption good firm, and capital good firms. These are the so-called interesting agents that are in our economy. So consumption good firms receive machineries from capital good firms and apply for loans at the banks. So in this case, consumption good firm 2 is connected, let's say, is client of bank 1, and consumption good firm receives 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 machinery from capital good firm 1. Of course, according to how capital good firms are connected to banks, in this simple version, they just deposit their own profits and cash reserves at the banks. Depending on the linkages between consumption good firms, capital good firms, and these two with the banks, we can imply that just because they have to manage payments, bank 1 and bank 2, they are connected among each other. So this is probably okay. Once we have explicit how two banks may be connected, we have to describe now under which conditions the link between these banks exist and persist over time. Okay. Since I mean we are expliciting a system of payments among agents that lead eventually to the persistence of interbank position. This is a graph that maybe you know very well if you consider the theory of endogenous money as well-defined framework in order to model the process of money creation. So whenever a bank grants a loan to a particular firm, the firm receives these funds, which are automatically deposited at the bank itself. So in this way, money creates itself. Is the process of money creation is endogenous, and we adopt this perspective, this process of money creation, and especially when after we have decided to take this modeling assumption, we also consider credit relationship among agents in the economy a simple transfer of deposits. So what you see in the graph is just the first step. So before the firm applies for a loan to a given bank, she deposits her funds to the banks. In the second step, the consumption good firm investments are financed with a loan provided by the banks. In the third step, as we sketched before, capital good firms receive. Suppose that now a firm that is producing machinery has to send a given machinery bought by the consumption good firm. So there should be a payment corresponding to this transfer of assets, and capital good firms receives checks drawn on the bank account of the consumption good firms, which of course are deposited at their respective banks. This is done by means of transfer of deposits, and this transfer of deposits, of course, correspond to the payment for the machinery. So whenever the banks manages the payments, they instantaneously open an interbank position among each other that stems from the payments of the two agents. Now, if the consumption good firms make enough profits at the end of the period, the bank easily can close her position, her interbank position. However, the link among the two banks dissolves. However, and this is the key assumption in our model, if the consumption good firm defaults for some unexpected shortfall in demand, their banks suffer some losses. And however, for at least in the first subsequent period, the interbank position between the banks that manage the payments remain open, because the bank all of a sudden has shortages of funds because of the default of the consumption good firms that was linked to. So unless banks use their own reserve to repay the interbank liability, the interbank position remains open. For this, in this case, the banks that were still connected before, they have a link that persists until at least for one period ahead. So this is basically the mechanism underlying the formation of an interbank tie among two agents, among two banks, and this is the way we model the process of network formation. So how will bank now, once the interbank position remains open, you can say, okay, this is just a portion of bad debt that has been goes in the balance sheet of banks. We later in the presentation, I will explain how we give the banks the possibility, of course, of closing their interbank positions. How will they do it? Will be clear in the next few slides. So once the interbank position, once this mechanism leads to the persistence of at least for one period of for one time period of an interbank tie, of a tie between two agents, we can we can represent these ties with an interbank liability matrix, which is pretty straightforward. On the rows we have, on the first row, for example, we have all the interbank liability that bank one has against the others, and on the columns, sorry, you have the other way around, all the assets that bank one has with respect to the other banks in the network. Of course, each bank is characterized by a particular value of their equity, which if we consider it to be calculated as book value, we just we do not weight any particular assets or liabilities by its counterparty risk. So in particular, in this case, what we are trying to consider more once the interbank tie exists is that we can easily assume that, especially when focusing on interbank positions, the market value of a particular bank depends, for example, on the likelihood of default of the bank, the likelihood of default of other banks that are connected to a given bank, and accordingly, suppose the likelihood of default increases, the network structure, and also if the network structures increases, changes, sorry, the market value of this equity might fall. So how we do account for the probability that in an interbank network, the market value of a particular bank can changes just because of the condition, the financial condition of her own counterparty. We use the network valuation mechanism described that we said before of Barucca and co-authors, which basically is, as you probably know, is a generalization of the Eisenberg and Noe clearing mechanism, where basically they show that there exists a clearing vector for according to which all obligations in the interbank network are cleared. This does not imply that nobody goes bankrupt, but this has a nice property, this clearing vector has a nice property that minimizes the losses due to contagion. In particular, the generalization of the Eisenberg and Noe method developed by Barucca and co-authors is extremely helpful in our setup, because they prove that this clearing vector can be achieved, can be obtained without assuming full information of the interbank network structure. So, for example, the bank one only has to know about the interbank contracts with their own counterparties. Given this generalization, we adopt this clearing strategy, this clearing mechanism, because it fits in the overall K plus S model, which is in which agents are characterized by deep uncertainties about the future path of the demand they have to expect, and especially when these uncertainties are linked, tied to the technical change process. So whenever we use this clearing vector, ultimately serves as a weighting, as to weight in an appropriate way the values of a given bank's interbank asset, in such a way that losses due to contagion are eventually minimized. This implies that this vector is characterized by it embeds a probability of default for the bank B for a particular bank, and assuming a particular recovery rate on the bank that eventually may default. So how do we use this network evaluation mechanism, this clearing mechanism? We actually use it in our model in two ways. First of all, as a macro-prudential tool, because in our model, each bank supplies an amount of credit which is proportional to the bank equity, which in this case is the variable net NW BK at t minus 1, which weights, of course, which weights a bank fragility indicator, which depends on the amounts of bad debt that the bank has in its balance sheet, and inversely related to the level of external assets that the bank has. This is a sort of leverage ratio. And of course, this bank fragility indicator depends ultimately also on how the bank in making this decision about credit supply weights her own interbank exposure, which is basically this parameter, this weighting vector P, BT, which is, if you remember, is just what weights the correct valuation of interbank assets that minimizes the losses due to contagion. So by allowing banks to weight the interbank assets in such a way, losses due to contagion are minimized, they in turn ultimately affect also the amount of supply that they can offer to the consumption good firms. But we also use the network valuation mechanism as a behavioral device. Why? Because given the counterparty's probability of default, given a particular counterparty and its probability of default, a given bank may decide to close the position towards towards bank J, which is the probability, which is a bank characterized by a particular probability of default. So basically, we say that we use the network valuation mechanism as a behavioral device because according to the evaluation that the implicit probability of default that the network valuation mechanism embeds, the bank can use such probability, such expectation on the probability of default in order to decide whether to close the interbank position towards other banks. And the criterion here is based on a very simple endogenous profitability rule, according to which the bank B, for example, closes her interbank position towards a given bank J if the rate of interest on the central bank facilities is greater than a weighted value for the interbank interest rate. So every time the probability of default of a given bank is equal to 0, let's discard for a second the variable close I here. In this case, the interbank interest rate will be always higher than the interest rate paid by the central bank when banks deposited their facilities. So the reasons here to introduce this rule and to let banks eventually close their interbank position is to weight the interest is to allow the possibility for the weighted interbank interest rate to be lower than the interest rate paid on central bank deposit facilities. We also use this variable in order to, whenever a bank performs its own evaluation, and since the cleaning vector is common among all the agents, whenever a bank is characterized by a probability of default which is greater than 0, then this would mean that all the interbank position toward that bank will be closed. In order to avoid that, we also introduce we introduce carefully a way to model the borrower profitability, the borrower profitability, the bank creditworthiness in the interbank market by using this variable clause I, according to which that would offset eventually, just for some counterparties, the probability of default greater than 0. So this is the timeline of the events, which I don't know if I have time to go through it. But basically, since I haven't shown you any formulas about the model, which is a large scale, macroeconomic model, I will try to go briefly all through the timeline. So at the beginning of the period, the policy variable are fixed: capital requirement, tax rates, central bank interest rate, and so forth. The banks determine the credit supply. The capital good firms performs R&D and eventually discover new products or more efficient production techniques. Imitation and innovation takes place. Once consumption good firms receives, in the model is called brochures, which is a subset of all the machineries produced by all the capital good firms in the economy. These consumption good firms decide to buy the most convenient machinery. Whenever this happens, banks settle their payments, which is one thing that we explicit. Now, as we said before, firms compute in both sectors compute their profits. If profits are positive, the firms pay back their loans to the connected bank and deposit their net savings, if any. If the consumption good firms does not pay back the loan because she goes bankrupt, she defaults, the banks that are involved in the payment system have an open interbank position. Then we have banks that evaluate their interbank exposures via network evaluation mechanism, clearing mechanism, and decide whether to close their interbank claims. So profits are collected, and again, using the NEVA algorithm, if banks are still largely exposed to contagion risk, and this is the macro-prudential tool, they would adjust the leverage decision, so they will eventually constrain the credit supply in the following period. So I hope it's clear how I explained in the timeline of events how we use the network evaluation mechanism, which both for as a behavioral device when banks decide whether to close the interbank position or not, and also as a macro-prudential tool in order to eventually adjust the decision of the amount of credit to supply at the following period. So what are the results? As in all standard K plus S models, we have stable and self-sustained process of economic growth. We have that, in particular, financial variables grow more than real variables and display also higher volatility, which is something that is compatible with the empirical evidence. And what you should, I would like to stress again that here we are adopting a process for which a process of money creation, which comes from the theory of endogenous variable, and as been recently argued by Adrian and co-authors, Kumhoff and co-authors, also at the Bank of England. These, whenever we accept this framework, we are able to match a very important property of macro financial aggregates, which is that equity do not respond too much to changes in assets, while deposits and debts in total debt, aggregate debt in this case, responds with an elasticity very close to 1. This is something that we also find in our model when we pool all the observation between Monte Carlos and over time, and also the elasticity that we found are very close to what the empirical evidence has been clear about. With an elasticity, yes,
5 minutes. 5 more minutes.
Yes. With an elasticity of debt centered around 1 and an elasticity of equity lower than 1, almost centered at 0. So this kind of model, this kind of model in this version is able to reproduce sizable volumes of interbank transaction, and this is the asset side composition of a typical Monte Carlo simulation. So you have banks that have a sizable volume of interbank relationships, which is the yellow part, and also on the this is for the liability from the liability side, where the interbank liabilities are the one in orange. Now, what is important? We have been extremely parsimonious in modeling the network formation, the interbank network formation mechanism. And this is enough to explain an ensemble of facts that have been observed in the empirical literature, especially when it comes to interbank network statistics. We are not going too much into detail on that, but I would like to, because I mean, our network is also kind of simplified because it's already implemented in a large scale macroeconomic model. However, we have, for example, that big banks have a larger number of degrees, which of course sounds reasonable, but is also compatible with empirical evidence. The network density of our interbank relationships that characterize our interbank relationships tend to reach a plateau. It means they are kind of is kind of stable, and also displays a disassortative behavior, which is something that we also encounter in the empirical evidence. What is very important here is that this very simple mechanism enables us to meet a very important stylized fact on the interbank markets, which is that big banks are net borrowers.
Sorry,
Small banks are net lenders in the interbank market.
Gianluca?
Yes?
I have a clarification question. And
yes, sure.
Everybody's seeing, so I'll just jump in. What do you mean these networks? So because it's a big network, right, with all the types of agents. So all these statistics, are they only for the networks where the agents are only banks, or also do you include in just firms or?
Okay, thanks for the question. Sorry, maybe I was not clear. These statistics are only they are relative to the interbank network here, and all the network that we are assuming a given structure, a given network structure for firm-to-firm relationships, firms to banks relationships. And what we argue is that since banks are in the interbank, are agents that manage payments, there is an implied interbank structure, which is a map of the networks that I said before. But the statistics that I'm showing here, they refer only to the interbank markets.
Okay, and then the size of the banks are given by what?
Just banks. Banks
No, the size of the banks. You have small, medium.
Yes, this is the number of clients attached to each bank that each bank
That's
has.
exogenous.
Yes, they are exogenous because they follow a Pareto distribution as compatible with the evidence.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
In the very last part of the presentation, that I will try to briefly describe, we try to perform an experiment in which we are assessing to which extent the network evaluation mechanism is effective as a policy for reducing systemic risk exposure. So basically, we test by means of scenario comparison, as it is typically done in agent-based models where complex stochastic behavior is usually observed. We compare the performance of the economy with respect to a benchmark scenario. In our benchmark scenario, here we allow banks to use the NEVA both to close the position with other banks and also to adjust the leverage, meaning adjust the credit supply according to a particular weighting of the interbank exposure. These are the results, which must be interpreted in terms of ratio with respect to the baseline. So what we observe is that whenever the network evaluation mechanism is implemented at full stage, so both for closing the position and adjusting the leverage for the supply of credit at the next period, we are able to reduce the losses due to contagion because they are systematically higher when we don't use the NEVA to do one of the tasks. Also, the number of defaults increases when banks do not adjust their credit supply for the next period. And this is shown by this coefficient here. Of course, the number of, despite not significant, here when the banks are not closing their position, it means that they eventually let all the interbank positions, all the interbank liabilities accumulate in their balance sheet until some point, maybe a bank will default eventually. So just these are the key let's say aspect of these scenario comparisons. Also, we observe that even not by much, the overall performance of the economy decreases when we don't adopt the network valuation mechanism at its full stage, because we are still in the process of interpreting these results. But we think that since banks are somehow more resilient because they are appropriately weight something that do not take into account before, this performs the resilience of the financial system and also ensure that a steady stream of credit supply is offered. So just to conclude, we have tried to model one of the most important missing link in the K+S model, which is the interbank relationships that stems among banks. But by expliciting an already existing structure of interbank relationships, we are able to replicate several stress facts concerning the interbank markets and the interbank network. What we in the last part we show that whenever a policy that uses a policy for systemic risk mitigation that implements the network evaluation mechanisms is able to reduce systemic risk and financial instability, and also does not tighten financial constraints significantly. This means that the channel that prevails is the one that operates by a more stable financial system and a more steady stream of credit supply. Thank you.
Thank you, Gianluca. So now we can open the floor for questions. If you have questions, feel free to just unmute yourself.
I have a question, if I may.
Yes, sure. We do have a little bit of background.
Yeah, I'm sorry. In the office, I'm trying to.
Oh, it's coming from me. Okay, no worries.
I'm trying to make it quick. Yeah, sorry. So it seems like the policy that you propose, like NEVA, is, kind of the. So you presented it as like the best way of doing things, right? I was just wondering, are there kind of alternatives that you considered in terms of like clearing, or is there any role for like a regulator to improve the outcome, or is it just kind of, the first best outcome that you can achieve with this kind of implementation? Yeah, if you could maybe shed a little bit more light on kind of the background of this algorithm and how it compares to potentially others. Okay, thank you.
I think you're muted. Yes.
Sorry. Shall we collect some questions first, or should I reply?
We could do that. I think we have another question from Sander.
Yeah, hi, Gianluca. Thanks for that presentation. I wonder a bit about the balance sheet of the banks. That's on slide 11.
Yes.
Yeah. So when there is a transfer of deposits between the banks, I assume that they also are transferring reserves, central bank reserves. Otherwise, it would not be a consistent balance sheet anymore. And related to that is a bit, so what you call these open interbank positions, which are created as a matter of fact when there is a firm that defaults on a loan, so it doesn't pay back this loan. So what I'm missing on the bank's balance sheet is basically a loan loss reserve, which is exactly accounting for these types of loss. And when there is a bad debt, it has to cut into the equity of the bank in order to cover this loss. And so when you are presenting something on systemic risk and macro-prudential policy, it's of course, it's a very important liability on the balance sheet of a bank, the loan loss reserves. And that's in fact what you hear if a bank is not, if it's failing a stress test, for example, then it means that the loan loss reserve is too low with respect to the risk it's running. So having not have that dynamically adjust with the loans that the bank is giving, it is, to me, it's quite odd to put it on the liquidity side, because what you're saying is that when there is an open position, the bank can cover this by the reserves, whereas it should cover it by the loan loss reserve, which is a liability. It's not an asset, right? It's a liability carved out of the equity. So if you can address that question, if you have considered this, if it is kind of too non-parsimonious, if you will, how it compares to other papers, maybe. Thanks.
Thank you, Sander. Is there any other question? Maybe you can start answering these two, Gianluca.
Yes. Okay. Thanks for the questions. They're all very good questions and points that have not been raised during the presentation. But yes, we are in the way we are trying to write the paper. We should address them definitely. In particular, to answer to Mark's point, how do we think about NEVA to be implemented? The NEVA is just not a nice trick that allows banks to minimize the spread of systemic risk and the loss due to contagion, but the nice properties that they have, and especially in the version where it is implemented, has been derived by Barucca and co-authors, which is, okay, under the generalization of the network valuation mechanism, Barucca and co-authors obtained two important results. The clearing vector is the same, notwithstanding, first, when the performance of this evaluation is done, at maturity or before. Second, they do not need to know, the banks, they do not need to know the full structure of the interbank liability matrix, the full structure of the interbank network, but just their own counterparty, the contract that they have with their own counterparties. This means that the cost for collecting information and assessing appropriately the systemic risk that each bank is exposed to is can be eventually dramatically reduced by, for example, enforcing or suggesting banks to adopt the same framework when evaluating risk. Because now we know that models that banks have some degree of arbitrariness when assessing their own risk exposure, both from the real sector and in financial markets. However, if they, with these properties of this model, of this clearing mechanism, I don't, maybe it's too much. This will eventually converge also to as a tool in order to manage interbank position and in the exchanges in the interbank network in a more efficient way, such that the losses eventually due to contagion are minimized. So this will be a tool that for banks will be not costly at all, and will be implemented, and if implemented, is able to deliver an assessment of systemic risk, which is very likely to help banks to be more resilient and also to exchange, adjust the interbank positions appropriately. For what concerns Sander point, thank you very much. Yes, I mean, in the presentation, we are not expliciting the way in which a bank can use central cash reserves in order to close their interbank positions. But yes, implicitly, all the banks are depositing all the cash reserves at the central banks. And for now, this channel is switched off in order to disentangle better the effect that was just stemming from the real shock transmission and to the financial transmission mechanism. Yes, but however, in our balance sheet specification, we do have cash reserves that are deposited at the central bank, which ultimately controls all the supply of high-powered money. I don't know if I answered to your question.
Do you have a follow-up question, Mark or Sander?
I don't want to hog the discussion. Just maybe very briefly. So, is there a role for like a policymaker to improve the results in your like a social planner kind of situation? You know, is there a way to make it more efficient or better, or more stable, or is it already optimal?
I mean, if the objective function of the policymaker is just to reduce systemic risk, then this strategy would be optimal given the setting, of course. But what I'm saying is just something more conservative, to be honest. It's like the NEVA as both when analyzed in its very specific properties, so in a very stylized model, very stylized example, like the one developed by Barucca and co-authors, is able to, they've shown that it is able to reach the same clearing vector of the Eisenberg and Noe mechanism, that in turn implies the lowest level of systemic risk propagation in a particular time set, in a particular interbank setting. What we have shown is that whenever this valuation of interbank assets is done in a more sophisticated, large-scale macroeconomic model, these results are luckily, I would say not luckily, but it's how can I say? We do observe the same properties that this model has, meaning to reduce systemic risk propagation. Moreover, we also have tried to assess here better what are the implications of the macroeconomic performance as a whole. And we have seen so far, from the simulation that we have, is that the situation of the economy is not worsened, and if for some key economic variables is actually the other way around. So I would suggest from a policy perspective that along with other internal models of risk management, of risk assessment, if you use the NEVA, you can have a very important information that is actually able to protect you from risk propagation, from systemic risk propagation. And eventually, if you want to do it, if you want to insert this in an optimizing behavior kind of type, kind of thing, if, or this is also a coordination problem, of course, if everybody is adopting the same internal model for risk, for the calculation of risk, systemic risk, then everybody will follow on the same kind of behavior. So the strategy will be common, and it will be easier also in terms of prices and the volumes exchanged, that the volumes and the prices exchanged will converge to the value that is as predicted by the model.
Great, thank you, it's very clear.